Start recording?
Yeah, okay. Okay. Welcome to our last talk of the transportation seminar. We are very pleased to have Professor Paul Waddell come in to give our last talk. To just give a brief introduction, Professor Paul Waddell is a professor and chair in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. He's kind of a leading scholar in integrated land use modeling and planning. He's probably better known for being the father of UrbanSim, a land use or open land use platform that's been widely used around the world. So for today, we're glad to have him to talk to us about a new addition to UrbanSim, Urban Vision, and how UrbanSim and Urban Vision visualization tool has been applied to the Bay Area to study sustainability. Okay. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Paul Waddell.
Thank you.
I was asking the wrong question. We're good? All right. So we're developing a laboratory at Berkeley. I've been there just a couple of years, and Liming and I actually worked together for quite a few years at the University of Washington before I relocated, and he joined me as a postdoc at Berkeley, and it was both a sad and happy day for me when he chose to come to accept this position here at Portland State. But your gain is my loss, as it were. Anyway, so we're developing an urban analytics lab at Berkeley and have gotten involved with quite a few other departments on campus trying to build a very collaborative, interdisciplinary research effort around urbanization and sustainability broadly, but also in particular focusing on developing analytical techniques and visualization methods to support sustainability planning. So I'm going to talk about, in particular, climate change and how California is approaching it, and in the Bay Area in specific, how regional agencies are coordinating their efforts, and then our involvement in that project. So I motivate the talk with this initial slide, which shows what the historical trends have been from 1990 through 2010, and then what the targets are out to 2020, the sharply declining red line, which, if you extended it out to the targets to 2050, would continue very sharply dropping from there. These are really important goals for reasons that I think all of us understand very well. But whenever you see a discontinuity in a curve like this, it should give you at least some degree of skepticism about the difficulty of accomplishing that change. So the challenge here is how to take legislation which has been some of the most aggressive in the nation in California, AB 32 and SB 375, that set these targets and set mandates for regional planning agencies to use land use as a new tool in addition to transport policies and infrastructure, and fuel and vehicle fleet mix policies to try to curb greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really quite a substantial challenge. And to put it in a more narrative framework, someone by the name of Lazarus wrote a paper that built on some early work by Mel Weber several decades ago. Mel coined the term wicked problem to describe problems that are poorly understood. There's disagreement about what the nature of the problem is, about causes and effects. and much less agreement even about strategies to proceed and solutions. So Lazarus took that idea and appended yet another adjective to it and said, climate change is really a super wicked problem. And the innovation he was trying to capture here was that the longer we wait on climate change, the more difficult and challenging the problem becomes. So waiting is not really a very effective strategy. So we really do have a really incredibly serious challenge. The trends are going to be hard to change. The level of agreement about what causes climate change and what kinds of ownership different entities should have in addressing these problems will remain problematic for some time to come. And yet, we have to take action. So in the Bay Area, the regional agencies that are involved, I've listed them here, 5 different regional agencies, are trying to coordinate their efforts. And they're working under a framework called the Sustainable Community Strategies process that's dictated by Senate Bill SB 375 that mandates that Metropolitan Planning Organizations coordinate land use and transport policies to begin addressing greenhouse gas emissions. That process is well underway. It's been organized around creating 5 different scenarios, of which one is being adopted as a preferred scenario to try to meet a target for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And our role in the project has been threefold: to participate in modeling, scenario planning, and visualization. And I'll be talking about those elements mostly in 2 parts, the modeling and the visualization. Part of it addresses indirectly the scenario planning work that was already going on at the Association of Bay Area Governments. This slide is one I like to use to motivate essentially what I refer to as a paradigm shift that I think is going to be required to do anything even remotely approximating the goals that have been set. And I think the basic preoccupation that we've had historically with the efficiency of moving vehicles, single occupancy vehicles largely, on freeway systems and the level of service on those freeways is beginning to give way to more attention on the ease of access that people can have by more closely associating land uses, mixing land uses and building at greater density, and serving that with better urban designs that make it easy to get out of a car and use pedestrian and bicycle modes and transit modes more effectively. I mean, that is essentially the challenge of SB 375, is how do we get less of what's on the left and more of what's on the right if we're going to get enough reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Now, fortunately, I think most people that look at these images would say, I'd rather be on the place at the right than on the left. But still, getting people to drive less is not a small task. So I'm going to talk about this project in 2 parts. One is the modeling part, and the other is the visualization part. The modeling part is based on work that I've been involved in for quite a number of years, and Liming has participated in developing this work as well, very actively over the last decade. So UrbanSim is an integrated model system intended to work with transport models developed by Metropolitan Transportation Agencies. It's open source software, and there's a website listed here for linking to it. There have been a lot of collaborators involved in its development over many years. Most of the funding has been from the National Science Foundation, although public agencies, including the Oregon Department of Transportation, and the initial application of this, I see Bud Reef here, with the Lane Council of Governments in Eugene Springfield back in 1998 led to, was documented in our first real significant publication on the UrbanSim project in the Journal of the American Planning Association. It's now being used in a pretty wide variety of metropolitan areas across the United States. By some surveys, it is the most widely used model of its type in the U.S. Internationally, it's extending through research projects mostly into other continents. Even South Africa has been using it most recently. So we think there's quite a bit of progress in trying to make these kinds of analytical and simulation tools available for planning and research exercises across the world. I don't want to spend very long on the analytical history or history of the academic research behind it, but I do want to give credit where credit is due. And UrbanSim builds on some pretty strong foundations that have been developed over many decades. The development of disaggregate choice modeling, of bid-rent theory, of microsimulation, of geographic information systems, all really participated in laying the groundwork for developing this kind of a model. And it differs from historically developed models that were more aggregate in nature. The aggregate spatial interaction models of the type used in gravity models for trip distribution purposes often is an early example of that. And spatial input-output models, which are also aggregate in nature. So just to really quickly encapsulate the core ideas, the theoretical ideas, random utility theory was developed initially by Daniel McFadden, who won a Nobel Prize for this, a Berkeley economist. And it's the basis from which all of our multinomial logit and various permutations and generalizations of discrete choice models have been developed. Urban economics, and in particular the idea of bid-rent theory, came from a cluster of academics that developed the field of urban economics. Most of those ideas were grounded in very analytical, calculus-based models that were grounded in the monocentric model that you could graph on a two-dimensional chart. But the core ideas actually extend very nicely to describe current cities, even as polycentric and decentralized as they are. And the idea in bid-rent theory is essentially that if there's an amenity value to a location that somebody values, like accessibility or a view or good quality schools, then the people that value that amenity will be willing to pay more for using those locations. They'll bid up the prices, and by competition, the ones that are willing to pay the most will earn the right to locate at those locations or build the buildings that occupy those locations. So this helps explain why you see higher density nodes around high accessibility locations, downtowns, transit centers, highway exchanges, and so forth. The next building block is hedonic price theory, and this is work that was done initially by Ken Rosen and others that looks at how we can analyze statistical data on real estate transactions, the sales price of single-family homes, for example, and try to infer from the sales prices we see how much people are willing to pay for the amenities that that house includes, like how many bedrooms, how many square feet, whether it has good accessibility or not, whether it has a high walk score or not. Right? And so this gives us statistical machinery, essentially, to unpack sales transactions and calculate the implicit prices of these different attributes. The next building block is an approach to thinking about equilibrium in markets. And where UrbanSim really differs from a lot of the prior work is that it does not make strong assumptions about the market having a full clearing or full equilibrium. So all of the previous models have essentially assumed that land use instantaneously adapts to changes in, say, transport. So there's a full equilibration between land use and transport that doesn't have any time dependency or path dependency. It just happens. And while that may be useful for doing a microeconomic exercise to look at what happens when you shift the demand curve and what's your new market clearing price, it's not very effective at really understanding real estate markets in spatial detail. And if you look at the real estate market and the economy, and even the global economy over the last 5 years, it would be hard to really make a very strong claim that any aspect of that represents equilibrium. All right, we had a massive bubble in the housing market that was led by financial derivatives from mortgages that were packaged in ways that were highly risky. It led to a very inflated housing market, and we're still trying to find our way out of the bottom of that housing market collapse. That is classic disequilibrium. Right? The market being not subject to standard assumptions about how markets work under perfect equilibrium assumptions. Next, we draw on the work of Guy Orcutt and others that pioneered the work of microsimulation. And in this work, the methodology is essentially to represent individuals directly instead of aggregating them, and represent space in as much detail as possible instead of aggregating it. And I think this also makes it a lot more realistic to do urban modeling in ways that represent the way the market works and the way places actually function. And then last, of course, we draw heavily on spatial analysis and GIS. A core concept that ties the model system together is how real estate markets function and how the different agents in real estate markets interact with each other. So I've isolated here the key players, and this represents governments, of course, which regulate land, zoning, urban growth boundaries, things such as that. They provide infrastructure, not only transportation, but water and sewer, and then they provide services such as police and fire and parks and so forth. Developers are taking raw land and also redeveloping to create new structures, whether they're housing for households or non-residential buildings for businesses. And then households and businesses are interacting in the labor market. So these are the markets and the agents that we're trying to represent, and we're trying to do this in a way that allows us to look at what happens if governments make different policies on land use regulation, or they make different investments in the transportation side. And ultimately, this leads to a schematic like this that tries to represent how we package behavioral aspects into models. So we have models that represent how households change in structure over time, models that represent how households make choices in the housing market, where they locate, how many vehicles they own, where they work, and then short-term choices about activity and travel behavior that we represent through connecting UrbanSim with a travel model. There's a similar set of models on the right-hand side of the diagram that shows our representation of businesses, growing, contracting, starting, or dying, and locating, acquiring different amounts of labor in different locations, that is their amount of employment, and then goods and freight movement, again, through connecting with the travel model. And then in the center, we're dealing with governments not really trying to model or predict their decisions so much as trying to represent, if they make different decisions, what would be the impacts of that on the market. Okay? And then developers are the final component here, trying to analyze how real estate development works and how developers make choices. So we're doing this not only representing individual jobs, businesses, households, and persons, but also individual parcels and buildings. It's a very microscopic representation. Do you have a...
We were having a technical issue with your mic.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. People do watch
All right.
on the web. It seems to be, just make sure the connection. Okay. It seems to be when you're moving around.
I'll not move.
I'm
I'll
sorry.
stay frozen in
I'm sorry
space.
to interrupt. We do have people watching on the web.
Okay. All right. Just have to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if something's not working. All right, so we essentially create this connected graph of the entities and the built environment. And I'll talk more about that in relation to accessibility in just a little bit. We can analyze different kinds of policy packages, transportation and land use policies in combination, and combine those into scenarios. And let me, help me with time management.
We actually have 45 minutes.
Okay. All right. So let me know about how far into that we are. I haven't kept track. Okay, good. All right. So the idea is to try to make a really effective environment for planning agencies to analyze packages of policies and explore their possible consequences on outcomes that reflect built environment and transport outcomes and environmental outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions by combining the models and doing what-if analysis under different policy scenarios. I'm going to speed up a little bit to get through the next part of this. I don't know if you want quite as much detail as I've got here. One of the things we've been doing in the Bay Area model recently is developing a pro-forma-based real estate development model that tries to reflect how real estate developers actually make calculations and decisions about real estate development. So we have a product typology that's enriched a little bit on the mixed-use side of the market to better reflect more recent innovations in terms of mixed-use development, higher intensity development that needs a little bit more nuanced treatment to reflect. It's very relevant for transit-oriented development and higher intensity zoning. We try to reflect both fee-based development, which would represent built-to-suit kinds of projects or government-sponsored projects. Transit-oriented development or affordable housing projects often are heavily subsidized projects, so they fall into that category. And then also speculative developments, which is the normal mindset we think about developers as being speculative. They go out and build things and hope that somebody comes and purchases it. So we have the model structured in two elements to reflect that division: user-specified events and the speculative development model. I'm going to skim through these examples of user-specified events just to give you a sense of the scale of planned developments. These are some projects in the Bay Area that may be impacted by the loss of redevelopment funding and the mechanisms that are changing rapidly in the state, but they're quite substantial. Here, for example, is the Hunters Point Shipyard and Candlestick Point current site and what it's planned for. So a major reformulation of this. And you can imagine if this happens as it's currently planned, it will impact the market around it in quite substantial ways. These are really large-scale projects. $2 billion of investment for this particular project, of which $600 million is coming from private developer sources, and the rest is essentially subsidized. Now, the project may change form radically with the loss of redevelopment, but it gives you a sense of the scale. Now, to support this kind of planned development analysis, we started creating some graphical tools like what you're seeing here. This is an early version of it that uses place types as a high-level construct to allow a designer to lay out a planned development. And I'm going to fast forward over most of this to give you a sense of a first application of this particular technology was working with Peter Calthorpe, an architect and urban designer, to lay out a technology park in Bangalore, India. So it used this prototype development system that we've coded to do urban design in a really interactive way, taking into account the geometry and the connections between streets and blocks and parcels and buildings and building and place types. So we think it's a pretty interesting innovation to facilitate handling large planned developments in either a redevelopment context or a greenfield context. Now, going through the speculative side of the model, it begins with trying to analyze how do developers find sites to build on. And they basically use three different tools. They look at underutilized property, where entitlement might permit a higher intensity development to be built. Or they look at listed properties where a broker approaches them and says, I've got a property, would you want to consider this for a development? Or they track hot markets, that is where absorption and rents and past experience of other developers suggests that there are opportunities for more development. So we try to emulate those three components in the new real estate development model. Then we look at site configuration. This is work in progress. This part's not quite finished, but we can select a site, consider it for evaluation using pro-formas, and then look at alternative configurations, like if they annexed the parcel on the left or the parcel on the north, if they could acquire those sites and consolidate that into a larger planned development. This is particularly important for inner city or already built up urban areas that are looking at redevelopment as a significant source of new development capacity. So then we have to look at the market demand side and competing factors and existing sites to explore how much market demand there is for development, and at the costs of development that include acquiring the existing site. So this gets particularly complicated because we have to take into account what the seller might sell the property for, and they have alternative ways of estimating how much they think the property is worth. The one that's particularly a problem for planners, I'd say, is the last one, which is based on entitlement development land residual analysis. Entitlements are what the zoning permits. Now, if you say, I want to build a transit-oriented development project, I've got a new station I'm trying to create, and I'm going to upzone the zoning around that transit station, and you make that information public, the property owners that now have been notified that the zoning, the entitlements have been increased, if they're approached by a developer, they now know that it's worth more, right? So they're going to ask a higher asking price for that property from the developer, and that changes the cost of the development. So there are these interesting and problematic issues around site acquisition cost and entitlements and information about that. Now, given a particular set of entitlements, a lot of planners often think that developers just build up to the maximum. It's always more profitable to build a higher density. That's not the case. It actually turns out that there's an underbuild factor that's pretty significant. And the reason for it is that technology and cost of development can increase in some ways very non-linearly when you go up to a higher density. So you may have to change the construction format to a platform or a steel construction when you go above a certain height restriction, for example. So often building happens below the allowed density for those particular reasons. So we put all these factors into a model. Originally we encoded it in Excel, and then we translated it to Python. We're in the process of speeding it up and dispersing it over a cluster to make it run really fast. But it basically takes into account all these costs, all these revenue expectations, and discounting over time to get a net present value of the return on investment. And what we can do is make that calculation many times for different types of buildings that might be permitted on a site and at different densities that would be within the allowed building envelope. So we can do an optimization both within a building type and across building types to find out what's the most profitable density and type of development subject to the zoning constraints. Okay? And that's how we identify which of the types of development are more likely to occur and design its density. So we think that we've made some pretty good contributions with this. We've been able to use the model in an actual planning process in the Bay Area and use it in particular to try to take a scenario-based vision that the Association of Bay Area Governments had adopted and essentially reverse engineer what kinds of policies and what kinds of subsidies might actually make it possible to achieve 80% of the growth in 5% of the area, which is what that plan called for, using priority development areas. So we think we're finding some pretty good application for this approach. I'm going to spend the latter part of the presentation on the visuals, which are hopefully going to wake you back up if I put you to sleep by now. We started working with computer graphics folks to create visualization technologies and combined all kinds of data down to the parcel and building level, street level detail, zoning, general plans, plan developments, business establishments, and so forth, and then connected them. So the key innovation here is that we're mapping each parcel to a node on the local street network. So in the Bay Area, that's 350,000 local street nodes. It's a pretty substantial street network, far more than is used in the travel models, about 20,000 nodes in that network. And we're able to calculate accessibilities and all kinds of urban design metrics very, very fast using this approach. The other thing that we're doing is working with procedural building generation of building models. So instead of using static Google SketchUp, we've coded algorithms that allow us to express architectural styles. And with the widgets in the top right, this is just a kind of a demonstration tool for this. We can show how, as the parameters change in terms of the building type, the width, the depth, the number of stories, roof, and subtype, and so forth, you can get very plausible representations of what that building would look like. Does it reflect an actual building? No. It's simply an encoding of a style of building given a particular set of constraints. And we think it's pretty compelling. So not the Target would turn into Best Buy necessarily, but you never know. Okay. I'm going to try to get this to go on. So then we scaled this up and applied it to the full region. And we have over 2 million parcels in the region, so it's a pretty substantial region. And I'm going to see if I can pause right here. So when you look at this, you can pretty quickly recognize you're looking at downtown San Francisco. And you probably mainly figure that out by looking at that. Right? So you've got a couple of icons that tell you, I know that building, and I recognize the general terrain and so forth. So what we've done is kind of hybridized having a handful of static models that are iconic. We call them landmarks, with the other 99% of the buildings being generic. So they're procedural models generated using the method that I just showed. And when you're kind of looking at it from a high level, it's good enough. When you're looking at it from close up, if you really know the area well, then you'd obviously object that this building doesn't look exactly like that. But it gives you a good flavor of it. And from sort of this scale of viewing and interaction for community engagement, for example, it's pretty plausible. So even though it's a 3D environment, we've kind of created a GIS-like interface to it, so you can edit parcel attributes. If you change the building from 3-story to 4-story, it regenerates that building on the fly. We've got animated vehicles and pedestrians in this version, although I don't know if we'll keep that. The vehicle flows and densities and speeds are coming from attributes from the travel model. So we connect the travel model network to this network and then simply give a visual representation of what that amount of traffic and speed would look like. So again, the purpose here is to try to make something that's useful for visualizing alternative scenarios and getting the community to have a visual sense of what that might look like. In this part of it, we're showing the building envelope visualization. So this is taking the entitlements, all the zoning that tells us about height restrictions and floor area ratios and setbacks, combining it with the, pause there, combining it with the information on the parcel geometry itself, and then calculating the setbacks, calculating the bounding boxes, and then extruding the box so that we can create a building envelope that you can actually look at. And the interesting thing is that we can actually sit that on top of the existing building models so that you can see the relationship between the existing building and the building envelope that the current zoning permits. So it lets you visualize the underbuild factor, essentially, at a rudimentary level. Okay, so the way we encode the zoning is by a zoning editor. And again, it's a standard GIS style interface. We've coded all this from scratch, but it looks like a standard GIS. So for each jurisdiction in the region, there were over 200. We coded their zoning policies, and they could be anything from traditional zoning to form-based codes. So we have the height restrictions, the floor area ratios, setbacks on front, side, and back, and parking requirements that could be coded and further analyzed. But the real motivation for doing all of this was to be able to do scenario comparison. So MTC wanted something where we could allocate a particular scenario down to the parcel level, out to the year 2040, and have 3D visualizations that would be plausible interpretations of that. So we created a split screen view so you could look at two scenarios side by side, a time slider at the top so you can see what happens as you move back and forth from today to 2040. And it's basically an intuitive way to compare two different scenarios in that situation. Now, I would say that our experience with this was mixed for reasons I may come back to in the question and answer period. Back to accessibility for a moment. That connection of parcels to streets allows us to do walk score much more generally. So we can interactively calculate, this is not sped up at all, at different depths of search going out along the network, anything like number of shops or restaurants or average density or average price of housing, basically any attribute that's connected can be queried interactively like this and mapped at different levels of spatial detail with different depths of query. So we think we've created something that's much more general than walk score and much faster. And we're starting to use this kind of technology to better understand relationships with observed behavior like walking. So, for example, we did some analysis comparing the correlation between walk score, the publicly, well, the private but web available walk score calculations, with walking counts, and found that there was about a 0.12 correlation. And when we compared that to other calculations we could make much more simply in this framework, just using, for example, an accumulation of the square footage of buildings within a short distance, we found that we get correlations of upwards of 0.5, close to 0.6. So we think we're onto something in terms of being able to quickly calculate spatial proximity and visualize it as well. So to wrap up, I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, hopefully. We've been involved in this project to facilitate the visioning that's going on for sustainable community strategies. We finished analyzing now 5 different alternatives for that plan. It's in the middle of an environmental impact review. And so while we finished the modeling, I'm not at liberty yet to show any results from the modeling because they have to go through various levels of approval at ABAG and MTC. But we think the proof of concept that we've generated here should be more generally interesting in other places. I'm particularly intrigued with the potential to increase our ability to represent the pedestrian scale. I think that's something that, as a field, we have not done very well, and it's important. And if we're going to be able to really tackle some of these problems of really curbing greenhouse gas emissions, we have to make places that are more vibrant and pedestrian-friendly and attractive from an urban design perspective. So I'm really intrigued with the ideas of trying to bridge analytical modeling with urban design and community engagement. I think it offers some really interesting future possibilities. So I think with that, I will close up and leave the rest of the time for questions and discussion.
If you're using urban sim to model a transit-oriented development, what kind of outputs do you get with that?
Okay, so the question is, if we're using urban sim to model transit-oriented development, what kind of outputs do we get with that?
Yeah.
The inputs to it, first of all, are the zoning and all of the calibrated models that reflect how businesses make location choices, households make location choices, and real estate developers make their development choices. And then also how prices reflect changes that arise from demand changes, supply changes, and so forth, and their interaction. So what we're able to do is analyze under a scenario in which we increase the zoning or increase the subsidies for development around transit stations, what the impacts are on increased development around transit, on the prices of the development that happen, and on what combination of households and businesses move into that development. So we're able to analyze essentially the whole portfolio of the built environment and the socioeconomic environment and the prices that are affected by those policies.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm curious, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but you had mentioned like doing these scenarios based on existing zoning, showing like what the maximum potential is for that development, where it is. So would it be possible to use this as an advocacy tool for different zoning or for form-based codes, as you mentioned?
So this is, I probably wasn't clear enough about that. So zoning is an input. We start with the existing zoning, of course, as a base. And in the what we call the no project alternative, the one that's the base of comparison in the EIR process, it's largely built around the existing zoning, existing urban growth boundaries, and so forth. Each of the other alternatives have different zoning configurations. And one could use the tool, therefore, to advocate for, to generate a scenario that uses form-based codes, for example, in a certain jurisdiction, and demonstrate that you get beneficial outcomes from that pattern of zoning as compared to existing zoning. right? So you would run 2 scenarios, and you'd look at the various sets of indicators that you could generate from the model at the end of that process, and look at the full portfolio of effects, and use that to advocate if it turned out to be better. Yes?
Have you had any work in communities that are non-metropolitan, that are rural areas, and would the model be useful in those scenarios?
That question's come up a lot, and I have somewhat, well, my first answer is no, we haven't modeled purely rural communities that are, say, completely separated from metropolitan influence, a more agriculturally centered rural economy. We haven't done that. I have enough respect for the differences to think that it won't be trivial, that we would need to more deeply understand the agricultural economy and its interactions. So I've got a healthy degree of respect for the challenge that would be involved. What we are starting to do more is analyze not only the metro area, but the fringe areas around it. I mean, if you look at the 9-county Bay Area, it involves a lot of rural territory. And so the areas in Napa Valley and Sonoma that are in vineyards are heavily protected from development. They also create an amenity value for real estate. And so there's a particular dynamic of interaction between the agricultural sector in the northern part of the Bay Area and the small communities that exist there that are closely affiliated with it, either from the wineries and the visitors to the wineries or from the agricultural production and processing perspective. So that's one kind of interaction that I think we're having to try to tackle more directly. There's another kind of interaction where urban encroachment into rural farmlands, more generally, starts to create a tipping point where farming is no longer commercially viable because the cost of the land has been bid up so much. So those are the kinds of things that we're starting to have to wrestle with. But modeling essentially purely rural communities and the dynamics of the agricultural sector in particular, it's not something we've done yet. There's interest in it, but it's not something I can claim we've done. Yes?
My question is, by changing the underutilized to a more dense urban area, how is that going to make any change to the urban heat island effect, pollution, smog? So is that a part of your simulation as well? Great
question. So again, I give a lot of caveats, things that we haven't done yet that I would find interesting to do, and this will fall into that category as well. I think we've got a lot of the raw infrastructure now to analyze heat islands. We haven't done it yet with this infrastructure. It would be very interesting to see that. And I think your question is well motivated in the sense that there is plenty of research out there that suggests that certain configurations of clustering of buildings of certain densities are more likely to produce different patterns of either shadowing or heat island effect and so forth. Some of those can be mitigated with materials and configuration. Some other people that I've interacted with in public health at Berkeley have been exploring a related set of questions around the trade-offs involved in our planning policies that tend to focus more heavily on moving people towards dense clusters to achieve transportation objectives, but may not look at, for example, public health side effects. So if you look at where active transport is happening, people jogging and walking and so forth, if they're walking along densely used arterials, they're exposed to a lot more particulate pollution and other pollutants that may be very harmful to them. So density by itself is quite a complicated package, and I think what we have to do is try to start unpacking some of that and start looking more closely at the side effects that can come with density and incorporate those into our design process so that if we can do things to separate better the vehicle traffic from pedestrian traffic, do things that treat materials differently and spacing differently so that we don't generate heat island effects that could be avoided with slightly different design patterns. I think there's a lot of room for doing really interesting work in that direction. Yeah. There's a question behind you as well.
I'm wondering, Paul, if you could describe a little bit more about the Pro-Forma real estate development model that you're, I guess, you've already developed or it's under development, and is that something you could describe some of the historical calibration of that? Is it more of a prospective rather than retrospective, back-tested kind of model?
Okay.
What all goes into that?
I'll wander into this question. You can redirect me when I haven't answered it. So we finished an implementation, and we have been using it for the Bay Area. It is prospective in the sense that we're analyzing what would be the pro forma and internal rate of return, net present value, of alternative development outcomes on particular sites, given the entitlements of those sites, and given the market conditions that we're simulating. Okay, so what's different than, say, a market research firm hired to evaluate a site today? They would go to the site, and they would start exploring the rents around that site. They would look at other current conditions and maybe recent trends in absorption and trends in rents. And they would use those to inform the assumptions driving the pro forma. What we have to do, because we're going out 30 years into a forecast horizon, is substitute simulated data for the data that a market researcher would collect normally. Right? So we have to keep track of rents and vacancies and absorption and use those estimates that are being generated by the model system to fill in the gaps in the pro forma analysis to make a prospective prediction on what the net present value of the rate of return would be. So that's the general structure of it. We're probably in the early stages of, I had a talk earlier today in which I described that the assumptions were largely held together with Band-Aids and Scotch tape. This was work done in a hurry under really fierce deadlines. The whole project, everything that I've described today, it's really two different projects. One is the modeling project, one is the visualization project. The first project was the visualization work, and we largely developed the visualization system in the first year from early 2011 towards the end of 2011. And it was used in public meetings in January of this year, 2012. The modeling did not start until late fall of 2011, and we just finished it. So all this work has been done under incredibly short time frames, and therefore we've had to make a lot of compromises in the assumptions. There's much room for improvement. So we're going to be re-engineering it again, trying to really refine it and improve the quality of the assumptions, and also tie it more closely to the visualization capacity and the design capacity, so that you could look at, say, a redevelopment context that a city is interested in working on and analyze alternative development patterns and look at the pro forma analyses on those under different parameters and different design configurations. So anyway, some of that's in the future, but we have completed this set of analyses in the Bay Area that are over 30-year horizons from 2010 to 2040 for 5 different scenarios that are part of the EIR process. So that part's complete. Yes, and then you. In the front first.
So as far as going back in history, how far back do you go? Is there a way to find out the impact of, let's say, the viaduct that was on the waterfront that was put in and then destroyed, let's say the Golden Gate Bridge, BART? Does your data just go back to the year 2010, did you say?
Yes. Where we've had better historical data, we've been able to do more. And actually in the Eugene Springfield application we did as a prototype, we were amazingly, thanks to people like Bud and former colleagues at LCOG, they were able to recover historical GIS data parcel data from 1980. This is almost inconceivable at this point. So this is before GIS, I think, was even coined as a term. It was CAD systems back then. Anyway, we were able to reconstruct history. The project we were doing was in the mid to late 1990s, and we had 1994 as a base year. So we were able to run the model from 1980 through 1994 and compare how it predicted versus what was observed over that period of time. And as you might expect, it was a fairly humbling experience. I think the results were pretty good. They were documented in our 2002 JAPA paper. The median of the errors was close to 0 on households. The tails it was a pretty normal distribution. Not too many had really large errors, too many zones that we were doing the analysis with. We didn't do as well on employment. And there were 2 large events that happened. One was the Gateway Mall that opened on I-5. And the other was the closure of the Weyerhaeuser plant in Springfield that happened during that time interval that we missed. Large-scale events. And so one of the things we learned from that is to incorporate, first of all, a high degree of humility in the modeling process. And I keep that with me wherever I go. And the other is to incorporate some infrastructure to allow users to insert known events or anticipated events or events that they want to analyze the impact of. So large-scale events can be not necessarily predicted accurately, but analyzed as an input, and then look at how the model reflects that.
So when you say humility, you're talking about just not getting everything you thought you would as far as data?
Yeah, I mean having not overselling the expectations that you're going to make accurate predictions at any fine-grained level of detail, 30 years into the future. It's not possible. So what we're trying to do is really just provide some analytical capacity that allows major, very costly decisions to be evaluated in advance without having to just simply experience the consequences. So being able to do counterfactual analysis and alternatives analysis in a principled way with the best tools we can generate is the objective. And it's a modest objective, but an important one. You mentioned the Viaduct project as an example. Interesting you would mention that because we did a paper on uncertainty analysis around the Alaskan Way Viaduct in Seattle, in which we were interested in the question of whether the State Department of Highways, WashDOT, the predictions that massive gridlock would happen if the viaduct got torn down and were replaced with a pedestrian boulevard or any lower capacity piece of infrastructure were plausible. And so we worked with some statisticians to develop a statistical methodology called Bayesian melding to essentially calibrate uncertainty, taking a period of time over which we observed the behavior and allowing the inputs to be uncertain and running the model repeatedly with random draws from that uncertain set of inputs, and then weighting the result or weighting the draw of those inputs based on the probability that the outcomes are a close match to the observed data. And running that many, many times allows us to get a weighted joint distribution of all the inputs, essentially a calibrated model of uncertainty. So then we analyzed 2 alternatives, one with the viaduct being replaced by essentially equal capacity to what it already had, and the other with the viaduct simply being removed. So essentially no capacity. So a worst case scenario. And what we learned from that was that, and there are lots of limitations to the study that I could go on about, but basically what it revealed is that running the model forward in time with uncertainty representation, so running it many times, generating distributions of those results, we were able to compare the 2 scenarios as uncertainty distributions. And we found that for the short routes that traverse the viaduct, there were quite distinct, visible differences in the distribution, so there was a statistically measurable impact from a lower capacity alternative, and probably underrepresented as well because we weren't adequately representing, say, bus stops and bus routing through the center of downtown. But they weren't large magnitude. They were distinct, but not large magnitude. And for the long commutes that would traverse, say, I-5, they were virtually indistinguishable. They overlapped so much. Right? So it was allowing us to begin to open a conversation about how could we analyze the effects of two alternative policies, taking into account uncertainty, and be able to say whether one policy is, at least on a statistical basis, definitely better than the other policy. Or is the uncertainty around the outcome so high that you really can't distinguish between them? Question there, and then yours. Yeah.
Assuming more trips would occur with a more dense commercial area, how would you, or in what ways would you mitigate the traffic that would occur in those areas?
I didn't quite get the first part. If there's
So
more interest in developing...
More traffic would occur in those areas that become more commercialized and become more densely commercialized?
I mean, I think it's a pretty well understood pattern that higher density comes with more traffic and more congestion. Areas that are successful are also typically congested. It's a pretty common pattern. Those are also places where you have opportunities to create more pedestrian activity, more transit, and to provide alternatives to being in a car in a congested situation. So, you know, I think it's a complicated question that requires a complicated answer. I think you don't just wish away the traffic. If you build more density, you're going to get more traffic. But you also create other opportunities to do something other than drive. You can do traffic signalization and other operational improvements to try to make it better. You can price for parking. You can have congestion pricing. You can do all kinds of things. It really depends on what the public's objectives are to try to mitigate those effects. It is a cost that comes with density. That's not to say that that cost outweighs the benefits, but it's a cost. Okay, I think we had one here. Maybe that's the last one.
Yeah, that will be the last one.
This is just a clarity question. So you have all these inputs, and it's amazingly complicated. Is the main output that you're looking for to figure out the actual greenhouse gas out? I mean, is that what the whole point is? Just to figure out like how much your greenhouse gases are going to go up or down? Or are you looking at
the purposes of the modeling are much broader than that. They are to provide essentially infrastructure for planning organizations like MPOs to analyze alternative transportation investments and land use policies on a variety of outcomes that are important to the region, whether they be economic outcomes, whether they be travel-related metrics, whether they be greenhouse gas emissions, whether they be affordable housing. You know, all of those things are important. So I'd say it's not a single-dimensional objective. The Sustainable Community Strategies process was largely motivated by a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that does not mean that that's the only relevant and important objective. There are many, many others. And the balancing of regional objectives like transportation efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions reductions with local jurisdictions and communities' objectives that may be far different, right, is where there's, again, tension between the objectives. And I think in that sense, you have to have a fairly comprehensive strategy to be able to address the competition between those objectives.